Okay, brilliant. So thank you all for joining this How to Apply webinar for the Seed Sourcing Grant, or SSG. My name is Megan Shirley. I work at the Forestry Commission and I'm the Incentives Manager for this scheme. I've also got Claire Trivedi on the call today, who's a Plant Health Research and Development Manager at DEFRA, and she's going to be delivering some of the slides with me. And also my colleagues Jack, Noemi and Ainsley are also on the call and will be monitoring the chat and helping with your questions. And I've also got the Forestry Commission FRM team on the call. So there's lots of expertise on hand today for all of your questions. So just to outline what we're going to cover today, we're going to start with the grant objectives and eligibility criteria for the fund. We'll then move on to how to prepare your application, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for you to ask your questions. As I said before, please put any questions in the chat as we go along, or you can put your hand up at the end. There's quite a lot of information in the slides today, so don't worry too much about making any notes. Most of it's available on gov.uk, and we'll also be sharing the recording with everyone afterwards, so you can always revisit anything that you missed. So I think I'm going to hand over to Claire now, who's going to be running through the first few slides. Claire, can you see the slides now? I know you were having some technical difficulties.
No, I've got a completely blank screen.
Oh no.
I'm just joining on my iPad, so let's see if that's better. Yeah, all right, I'm going to switch to my iPad. Hold on.
Okay, lovely. Thanks, Claire.
Right, okay, can everyone hear and see me? Yeah, and I can now, so that's a relief. That was a bit of a weird experience. Okay, so yeah, we're on the background. Sorry about that, everyone. Getting myself together. I'm Claire Trivedi. I'm the policy lead in DEFRA that leads on seed sourcing and the seed sourcing grant. So I'm just going to run through a few slides at the beginning. Some of you, if you've joined these calls when we've done previous SSG calls, will have seen these before. But yeah, just reminding everyone really and updating those of you that might not have. So the background really, as the slide says, I'm sure you're all familiar by now with government tree planting targets, which are extremely ambitious. We've got immediate term targets, but also longer term legally binding commitment to 2050 in terms of tree cover. And obviously, if we want to be planting young trees, we need tree seed in order to enable that. So the seed sourcing grant is around ensuring we have adequate tree seed supply to meet those targets, but it's a little bit broader than that as well. We're looking at diverse supply of seeds, so we're not just looking at the amount of seed, but the number of species that are available, the type of seed and the provenance. And that's because the end point we want to get to is that we're able to plant healthy and resilient woodlands. The other policy objective that we're working towards here is that the more seed that can be produced domestically, obviously that reduces the need to buy seed from the international market, and therefore that helps support our objective around reducing risks from pests and pathogens. So if we can move to the next slide, please, Megan. So the seed sourcing grant was introduced a couple of years ago. It's a competitive capital grant administered by Forestry Commission. And as I was just saying, the objectives are to support projects which increase the quantity, the quality and diversity of seed stands and seed orchards on the FRM National Register of Basic Material. This is one of 3 sort of sister grants that are all working together to enhance tree production. So it's designed to be complementary to our Tree Production Innovation Fund and our Tree Production Capital Grant, which hopefully several of you are familiar with. And this is the 3rd call for the seed sourcing grant. Go to the next slide. So in this call, we've got up to £260,000 available for the coming financial year. Funding is available for any species that are listed in the UK FRM scheme, and that includes the voluntary scheme as well as the statutory one. In a minute, I'll show you a list of 21 priority species, which hasn't changed from previous rounds. So activities that are supporting work on those species, we fund at 100%, whereas projects on other species are very welcome and will be considered equally, but they'll only be funded at 50%. You can apply for multiple bids, but it's a maximum of £75,000 per financial year across all of those bids. And we have a minimum bid amount of £2,000. So in terms of the activities that can be funded, again, there's absolutely no change here from previous calls. There's 4 key areas. So the first is management of existing seed stands to make sure they're as productive as possible for seed collectors. As I said at the beginning, we're looking to enhance the seed stands that are registered on the Register of Basic Material. So you either need to be working on a stand that's already registered, or you need to be bringing it onto the register as part of your project. And these management, it's not any kind of ongoing management payment, unfortunately, at this stage. It's just a one-off payment. So you would be proposing to us a set of activities to be carried out within the next financial year, and that would be it. It would be time bound. We also are supporting studies which identify and bring additional seed stands onto the register. So these are stands of trees that are already existing in the landscape, but that would meet the criteria to come onto the National Register. And they can be desk studies and or field studies. The 3rd activity is planning and planting new seed stands. And the 4th activity is planning and planting of new seed orchards. And you can have projects, and we have funded already projects that cut across these 4. You don't need to pick one or the other. So, you know, a project that works in a sensible way across them is perfectly acceptable. You can see here the categories of FRM that are covered by the grant. So essentially, we're looking at work to support both seed stands and seed orchards. And we're working right across the 4 types of reproductive material, from SI right through to tested. So the priority species strategies, this work was done before we launched the SSG a couple of years ago now. It was done by some forestry consultants, but also working with a range of experts that we brought together. They came up with a basic framework of the SSG grant, but they also, through that work, we identified 21 priority species. So essentially that was done through looking at the existing National Register of Basic Material and sort of essentially doing a gap analysis, but then also talking with seed suppliers and nurseries to understand where future demand might come from. And that's how we came to the 21 species. That list may well change in the future, but you know that still stands for now. But as I said earlier, the scheme is open to all species that are in the UK FRM scheme. Okay, Megan, and then just to finish up, the list is, all of this material is available on the .gov website, including the list of priority species, but just for your awareness, we just briefly show you that list now. I think that is the end of the section that I was going to cover. So I'm happy to take
Thanks,
any
Claire.
questions.
Thank you. I think if there's nothing burning, we'll probably wait till the end and take any questions then, if that's okay.
Yeah, let's do that.
So yeah, thanks for that kind of background to the grant. I'm now going to move on to the eligibility criteria. So first off, we have some broad criteria that your project must meet in order for you to apply. Claire's touched on some of these already. So your proposal must cover must include species covered by the UK FRM scheme, including the voluntary scheme. So there is actually a list of those on the seed sourcing grant finance spreadsheet, if you want to kind of find a comprehensive list. The seed stand or seed orchard must be in England. The work to be funded must not have started. The funding is only available for the 2024 to 25 financial year, so work can only start from 1st of April or whenever you have a signed agreement if you're successful. And then activities must be associated with one of the eligible FRM categories that Claire has already described. So this shows what the grant can be used to pay for. It's not an exhaustive list, but it covers most of the kind of items that we would expect to offer funding for. So things like staff and contractor costs, seeds and saplings to be used for creating kind of new stands or orchards, consumables and temporary infrastructure for management, contribution towards equipment. Just to note on here that we're unlikely to offer funding for kind of really expensive bits of equipment, but you're welcome to ask for a contribution to such equipment in your application, and ask for kind of that contribution to cover the costs of using it for your project. And yeah, that would just be up to the kind of evaluation panel's discretion. And then travel and subsistence for your project. We just ask that any travel and subsistence is carried out in the most economical and sustainable way possible. Just to note as well that you may want to look at the list of successful projects from round one to see what kind of things we've funded previously. We also have a lovely new case study from one of our round one projects, which was about managing a small leaf lime stand. So Noemi, if you could pop the link to those in the chat, that would be great. This next slide runs through items that are ineligible for funding. I'm not going to read out every single one because it's a long list, but basically any costs that fall outside of the funding period are ineligible. We can't pay for insurance for capital items or staff. Repairs and ongoing maintenance to equipment would be ineligible. Costs or overheads like rent and utilities related to staff employed on the project. And then also business as usual seed collection. So in the past, we've had a few people apply to do things like conduct a desk study, and then they've applied for collecting seed from those stands that they've identified. That kind of collection would be considered business as usual and wouldn't be eligible. If you're collecting source material to grow on for a new stand or orchard, that would be eligible. So do let us know if you need any clarification on that one. So moving on to who can apply. The grant is open to any UK-based public, private or third sector organisation, as well as private landowners applying for work on their own land. If you've applied to the SSG previously, whether you've been successful or not, you're welcome to reapply again in this round. We've listed the types of applicants here that we would expect to apply, but again, this isn't exhausted. So if you're not on the list, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't apply. We will accept joint applications, and we like to see collaborations or projects that seek external expertise. In this case, you will need to nominate a lead applicant who will be on the agreement with us and receive the funding. That organisation will then be responsible for kind of dispersing any funding to the partners. You'll need to list any partners on the application form and also explain to the panel how you'll be working together. Okay, so that covers the eligibility criteria. I'm now going to talk you through how to apply for the grant. So first off, we've got a few kind of tips for before you apply. So firstly, there's a lot of information about the grant on our gov.uk page, and we've also recently revamped our application guidance. So we'd really encourage you to read that in detail and make sure you understand the grant before applying. I think Noemi's going to drop a link to that guidance in the chat. If you're applying for a priority species, as Claire mentioned earlier, we have the priority species strategies. Please do take a look at those. We wouldn't expect you to necessarily follow those to the letter, but if you do decide to take a different approach, you'd be expected to justify that. It's also worth noting here that there's only a year in which to deliver activities for this round. So if you are following a recommendation from the species strategies that you can't complete fully by March 2025, you can apply for kind of one phase of a project, but you'll need to demonstrate to the panel what outputs you can achieve in that period, how those will kind of contribute to our grant objectives and what your longer term plans will be. If you're applying for a non-priority species, please think about where you'll source your 50% match funding from. And then also the grant is paid in arrears. So you need to make sure you have enough funds to pay for items initially before you can claim funding back from us. You're welcome to claim up to 3 times during the course of your project if you're successful. So that should help with cash flow. But yeah, you need to have some of the funds up front before you can claim back from us. It's also wise to speak to suppliers and contractors to get quotes so you can give confidence that your proposal is good value for money. And similarly, please check with contractors that they have availability and that your plans are realistic within the funding period. As I said, you've only got 1 year for delivering the project, so that one is really key. If you do that kind of research, please explain it in your application form, because the panel will look more favourably on applications which are well thought through and where you've clearly explored the value for money and deliverability. We've also included a few kind of overarching tips about your application here based on what we've seen in some of the previous rounds. So if your proposal includes planning or planting of a stand or orchard, please think really carefully about the sourcing of the material and the design of your stand or orchard, and give as much detail as you can about that in your application. Where your proposal includes a desk study to identify new stands, think about whether you could work with other organisations to expand the geographic area that you cover, as that could help to make your proposal offer better value for money. If you're new to seed sourcing, or particularly if you're planning a really complex project, we'd encourage you to seek external advice or guidance, or perhaps partner with another organisation with more experience. Something to flag here, we ran an all-day webinar back in 2022 called Seed Sourcing for Trees of the Future. That included some brilliant guidance and advice, which is really relevant to the seed sourcing grant. There were 6 sessions and they were all recorded and they're available to watch back. So I'd really recommend having a look at those. Noemi, if you could pop some links in the chat, that would be brilliant. And then finally, the panel has struggled in the past to understand exactly what some applicants are proposing to do or exactly what the outcomes of their project will be. So please make sure that you break down your activities and outputs really clearly so that they can understand your approach and what you're trying to achieve. If it's particularly complex, you're welcome to include appendices like Gantt charts to kind of illustrate what you're doing. Okay, so getting into more of the detail, this just summarises the application process. So you'll need to submit an application form and a finance spreadsheet. Those forms are available on the gov.uk website. I've put the link here, and you should get a list of the kind of documents which I've shown on the side here. All questions in the form are mandatory, and once you've completed your form, you can submit it to the SSG inbox. And the deadline this year is 5 to midnight on 13th of February. The application itself is made up of 10 parts, but quite a few of those are just for information or they're declarations that you need to read and agree to. Part 1 of the application asks for some details and checks if you're eligible for the funding. At the top of this section where you're asked for details, just make sure that you're using your organisation's legal name, as that's the organisation with whom will make an agreement if you're successful and where claims will be paid. There's then a list of eligibility criteria, which I've shown on the slide. Please read through that list carefully and confirm whether you fulfil each of those. When we receive your application, we will check that you meet each of those criteria before we can send your application to the panel. This next section is in a slightly different format to last round. So if you have applied before, kind of pay extra attention here. We're basically asking you to lay out the details of your project so the panel can understand what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve. And if you're successful, we'll use this information to form your grant agreement with us. So I won't go through every section because some are self-explanatory, but I'll just draw out, we've added a question about land ownership. So if you're planting a new stand or orchard or managing an existing one, we want to know where that will be, who owns it. If you don't own it, do you have an agreement in place with them? And we'd also like you to attach a map of the site. Then we've got these 3 sections at the bottom, so funded activities, which is basically what you'll be doing. And then for the outputs, we want to know what will result from those activities. So here we're looking for you to kind of give as much detail as possible. So for example, it could be the number of trees planted in a new stand or orchard, or the area of a stand that will be brought into management. And please be really specific in this section about what category of FRM your project will result in. So, for example, you could say, yeah, a selected seed stand of Betula pendula, just making it really clear what you're hoping to achieve by the end of the project. And then finally, the long-term outcomes are essentially what you expect to happen longer term beyond the period of the grant. Again, please try to give as much detail and quantify things where you can. So it could be that if you're planting a new stand or orchard, you could say the number of years you estimate it will take until that stand or orchard is productive. And yeah, you're welcome to just give your best guess here, because we know that there will be a lot of factors at play. So moving on to part 3, there are 8 assessed questions here, and this is the information that the panel will use to score your proposal. So please try to give as much detail as possible in your answers here while sticking within the word limit. You'll notice I've put in brackets the weighting of each question. The first 2 questions are weighted at 20% and the rest are weighted at 10%. Question 1 is about the species seed strategies. If you're applying for priority species, we're looking for an explanation of how your project meets the strategy, or a justification of why your approach differs to that strategy. If it's a non-priority species, we'd like you to give a rationale for your approach. If you're planting a new stand or orchard, please outline your approach to selecting the origin, genetic diversity of the basic materials. So that could include numbers of individuals, populations or propagules to be sampled. Question 2 asks what impact your project would have on sector capacity. So essentially, how will your project lead to more seed being available for tree production in England, and when will this happen? Please explain how you will ensure seed is collected and brought to market. So for example, if you've already been in contact with local nurseries or seed collectors, or you plan to. And then question 3 asks you to explain how you'll ensure the project has benefits into the future. So for example, how will you manage your stand or orchard long term so it's productive after the end of the grant? Question 4 asks you to describe your team, their skills and experience, and your organisation's track record. We'd want you to discuss any partners or subcontractors here as well. As I mentioned earlier, if you have no experience of seed sourcing, and particularly if you're planting a new stand or orchard or have a particularly complex project, we'd want you to explain whether you'd sought out any external expertise or guidance. And then question 5 is about deliverability. So how will you manage your project effectively? As there's only one financial year in which to deliver the work for this round, this question is really key. Please give us the main milestones in the project, and if you'd like to include a Gantt chart or project plan here, just attach that when you send us your application and refer to it in the question. Question 6 asks about risks involved in your project and how you'd mitigate these. Again, you're welcome to attach a separate risk log and just refer to it in your answer. And then question 7 asks about additionality. So essentially, what difference will public money make to your project? So perhaps the project wouldn't go ahead with the would only go ahead with the funding, or the funding would allow you to do it on a larger scale. Then finally, question 8 is about costs and value for money. So we want you to justify the cost of your project and why it represents good value for money. As I mentioned before, please explain how you've estimated your costs and what you've done to ensure best value for money. Just to mention here that in the past, some applications have included some slightly vague staff costs. Please make sure you explain any such costs and how they will be contributing to the project, so the panel's really clear on that. And then if you're applying for a non-priority species, please explain where your match funding will be coming from. Your finance spreadsheet will also be used to help assess this question, and I'll come on to that in a minute. Okay, so those are the assessed questions, and this just briefly covers how they'll be scored. So we've got a scale of 0 to 4 here, from unacceptable to excellent, and each answer will be scored using that scale. Each panel member will score your responses, and we'll then combine those to get an average for each question. After averaging, if your application scores 0 for any scored questions, or scores less than 20 out of 40 overall, it will be unsuccessful. I mentioned earlier that you need to submit both an application form and a finance spreadsheet. So the finance spreadsheet is basically a detailed breakdown of the costs for your project. I've included a few tips here. We've covered the first 2 of these already. I'll just add, though, regarding quotes, if you're likely to need Millennium Seed Bank resources, please contact Q, and I've put the Millennium Seed Bank email on the slide here to get costings before submitting your application, and include those costs in your finance spreadsheet. Just to flag that any items must be received and work must be completed by 27th of March 2025 in order to claim for it. So just bear that in mind when you're putting your proposal together. And then finally, if you're successful, you'll only be able to claim back irrecoverable VAT on your costs. So basically, if you would be able to recover VAT on your costs, please quote costs exclusive of VAT. If you wouldn't be able to recover VAT on your project costs, you can quote costs inclusive of VAT. So basically, it does depend on your individual circumstances. So do get in touch with us if you want any clarity on that one. This just shows you what the finance spreadsheet looks like. Just to mention, so the activity refers to those 4 activities that Claire mentioned earlier. And the grant contribution column on this spreadsheet will automatically calculate. So please just check that for any non-priority species, that doesn't exceed 50%. There's also a summary of costs box, which will automatically calculate. Please just double check that that looks right before submitting your application, because that will form part of your grant agreement. The final sections of the form are largely there for your information, so please just read them. In part 8, there's some check boxes, so please read each of the declarations in that section and tick if you confirm, tick to confirm that you agree to them. And then finally, in part 10, we ask you to sign the form. You can add a digital signature using Adobe or other PDF software, or you can just print that page off, sign it and scan it back in. But we can't accept typed signatures, I'm afraid. Also, please make sure that the person signing the form matches the person named in part 1 of the form. And then, as I mentioned before, you can submit your form to the SSG inbox. Okay, so next steps after you've submitted your application. So the deadline is the 13th of February. We'll then do an initial check for any missing information and to check that you're eligible. Keep an eye out for emails at that point, because we may come back to you if anything is missing. The panel will be meeting and reviewing applications towards the end of February. We then hope to issue outcome letters and agreements by 22nd of March. And then work can start from the 1st of April or when you've signed your agreement if you're successful. Please don't start any activity before you have a live agreement with us, because we won't be able to provide you funding for it. And then, just to mention that sometimes getting agreements out can be delayed if we need to come back to you for kind of questions or clarification about your application. So please factor that in when planning your project, that you may not be able to start exactly on the 1st of April. And also, the sooner you can get back to our emails, the sooner we can kind of issue you with an agreement. So yeah, that just helps to speed stuff along. And then our final slide, so thank you for bearing with me. I just wanted to explain how the reporting and claims process works if you're successful. So you'll need to submit an end of project report at the end of the project. And then in terms of claiming, you can claim at the end of the financial year or the end of the project, and on 2 other dates of your choosing. Again, you need to have received items or completed work before you can claim for it. When you claim, we'll ask you to submit evidence of all your expenditure. So please keep invoices and receipts. And if you're claiming for internal staff time, we'll need timesheets. And then once we have your completed claim, we'll pay by BACS transfer. The final deadline for reports and claims will be 27th of March 2025. Okay, so that's the end of our slides. As I said, there's a lot of information in there, so thank you for bearing with us. We will share the recording with you, so you can kind of revisit any of that if you need to. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see everyone. And I think we'll move on to the Q&A now. As I said, we've got Claire and the FRM team on the call to help with any more technical questions, and then myself and the grants team who can help with stuff about the application process. So Noemi, have we got some questions from the chat to kick us off?
Yeah, we do.
Thank you.
I can hear myself, but I'm sure that's going to go away. So yeah, we've had quite a lot of questions in the chat. Thank you everyone for submitting those, and thank you to Jack, Amanda and Claire for already answering quite a few. The first question comes from Helen that hasn't been answered yet. And she's asking, you say the funding is available to manage existing seed stands. Does this include seed orchards and areas that are planted for seed production, but not registered on the FRM database?
Claire, do you want to answer or do you want me to answer?
So, I mean, there's been a bit of several sort of to and froing with Helen on the chat. I think it might just be worth, Helen, did you want to come in and let us know if there's what your outstanding question is now, and it might be easier to talk it through rather than reply in the chat. Lost Helen. Oh no, she's coming. Oh,
Oh,
no, I can't
hear you. Yeah.
Okay, let me answer as best I can from what's in the chat. So Helen was asking originally whether funding is available to manage existing stands and orchards or areas that are planted for seed production but not registered on the FRM database. So the answer to that question is no, because we will only support work that is ultimately ending up supporting seed sources that are on the national register, and the reason for that is that we, you know, obviously with public money being invested, we want to make sure that these seed sources are, you know, available to all, everyone is aware of them, but also, if appropriate, that they've been inspected to make sure that they're meeting the right criteria. And then later on, Helen has asked whether that means SI, whether managing specific areas of source identified trees and shrubs come within scope. So that definitely does. SI stands are definitely eligible, but as per that previous question, they would either need to already be on the register or brought onto it as part of your activities.
Thank you, Claire. That's really helpful. Helen did have a follow-up question, but I'm not sure if she's on the call. It was directed towards the grants team, I think, and she's asking if you have received funding through the last round, does this affect how much you can apply for in this round? Is the maximum over 2 years £75,000? The answer is no. You can apply for the maximum amount per financial year. Yeah. Just trying to find another question that hasn't been answered. I don't know if there's anything else that hasn't been answered by Amanda or Claire. Does anybody else have a... No, that's great.
We're very
Does
open
anybody...
to answering any more if
Yeah.
people would prefer, because often it is better to have a short verbal exchange.
If anyone wants to put their hand up as well, please do. Claire, was there anything in the chat that you think it would be worth kind of reading out just for the benefit of anyone who's watching the recording back?
So there was several questions from Rihanna as well. I don't know whether she's still on the call, sort of asking really what seed stand planting is and who does that and how you can get guidance to do that. So planting seed stands obviously is a thing because we're supporting it. Often seed stands aren't purposely planted to be seed stands, but sometimes they are, and that's what we're looking to support. There's some guidance in the species strategies which are published as part of this call, but that guidance is sort of intended for a fairly knowledgeable audience. So I think if you're completely new to this, I would recommend doing a bit of wider reading around seed sourcing. Look at all the guidance that's available through the FRM team as well, and Amanda can talk a bit more about that, and also just talk to people that have done this before, so either forestry managers, consultants, or geneticists, depending on the scale of what you want to do. Just bring in expertise. I would really recommend.
I think, yeah, the ICF webinars are a good resource as well, actually, because I think they do go through, I think they probably cover most of the activities that are funded by the SSG.
We have a new question from Rodney. Seed stands and orchards set up under this grant, is there a future timescale to indicate when seed becomes available? And if there was a future change of ownership, is there any legal obligation to make seed available? A bit more complicated, that one.
Jack might be able to answer this. So we did talk a lot about this when we first set up SSG. And I'll need Jack to remind me of the detail, but essentially we recognise that the seed stands will go onto the National Register and therefore will be subject to that inspection regime. And so we would be noticing, FC would be recognising if a seed stand wasn't productive anymore or wasn't being used. And there is a clawback function there that, it is possible that FC would claw back any grant funding. I think it would depend on the context and how many years had passed and, that kind of thing. I don't know if Jack or Megan want to add any more to that.
Yeah, essentially there's no, like Claire said, we do have the power to claw back, and you would be subject to FRM inspections. There's no sort of specific like tail to the grant that would mean that we'd start hounding you if for some reason you legitimately had to change the land use. For example, if you had a pest or disease come in to an orchard or stand, then that's kind of outside of your control. So yeah, there's nothing specific there, but we do have powers to claw back. Yeah, and you'd be subject to FRM inspections, like Claire said.
A question from Anthony, directed to Claire. It looks like you have identified the underlying specification of minimum numbers that you mentioned as 30, but with a preference for a larger stand of mothers to select from. Is this just for the purposes of the grant, or does it apply to registration of a stand as a source for basic material purposes only, without a grant? Bit of a longer question, that one.
Yeah, no, but we've been discussing this, and Amanda and Ajay have been helping me answer some of these questions. We've had several questions from different people around this. That there is underlying guidance. Essentially, a good seed stand should be genetically diverse, is the bottom line. And the FRM team will be looking to only register seed stands that fulfill that criteria. The problem is that varies by species and context, and so the rules aren't hard and fast, but there is guidance there. Amanda or Ajay, do you like to add a bit more to that? Sorry, putting you on the spot. But...
Sorry, I was just trying to find my mute button. So yes, that there is underlying guidance, but as you've said, Claire, it really is, it can be species specific, but this is the sort of rule of thumb. We obviously have different criteria as well when it comes to source identified and selected options as well. But really, this is something, if you are uncertain in any way, it's worth actually just getting in touch with us and finding bit more, if you can tell us more information about what it is you plan to register.
That's really helpful, thank you. Does anybody have any more questions? Feel free to put your hand up as well.
Looks like, oh,
How do we contact Amanda's team about that? Amanda, would you mind popping in an email address or
Yeah, of course, certainly. I'll put our email
brilliant,
address
thank
in.
you. Perfect.
thanks, Amanda. I should just mention that, yeah, for any grant related queries, that SSG inbox that I mentioned earlier is monitored by the 4 of us in our team. So yeah, if anything comes to you after this webinar, please just drop us an email and we'll try to help you. Thanks, Noemi.
No problem.
Okay. Just give it a little bit longer, see if any other questions come out the woodwork. Just to mention, whilst you're all on the call, that the Tree Production Capital Grant is also open at the moment. We're closing for that grant on the 30th of January. So do check that out if you're a tree or seed supplier and you're interested. I think we've probably come to the end of the questions. So I'll wrap up, and yeah, do just drop us an email if something occurs to you after the call. Yeah, so thank you so much for joining today. It's really good to see so many people on the call and interested in the grant, and some really good questions in the chat. So yeah, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your afternoons. We really look forward to seeing your applications.